once you remove God, you can no longer say that, first, science leads us to truth, and second, something is scientifically impossible. Like, these statements are just not valid. Greetings, this is Eugene the Philosopher, the greatest living philosopher after the unfortunate passing of Quentin Robert D. Nameland, who has been the greatest living philosopher before me. This is the second part of my criticism of scientific method and science in general as the pathway to the truth, I gotta say. And I, again, like, reading the comments under the previous video, I gotta, emphasize right away who this video is aimed at, or rather, who I'm arguing with here, right? Or why even I'm making this video. I'm talking to raging atheists, alright? So, scientists, as in scientism, not the scientists as researchers, but scientists as proponents of scientism, right? This sort of a quasi-religious philosophy, I guess you can say, which claims essentially that science is the only, or at least the best pathway towards the truth. This is what I'm criticizing in this video specifically, alright? Alright, so, I would claim that science has at least two big fundamental problems. In the previous video, I've touched on some relatively minor problem, actually. Here we're talking about more fundamental problems, and namely, these, what I would call the problem of universal agency. That's one problem. It's where I would criticize how science is actually, it has nothing to do with the truth. And the second problem, I would claim, is the problem of empirical method itself. I don't have any fancy name for it, sorry. But let's examine them. So, in order to address the first problem, the problem of what I would call, again, the universal agency, let's take a look at how science began, alright? So science began roughly at the end of 16th century, at the beginning of 17th, right? With the works of, more or less well recognized that science began with the works of Francis Bacon. At least sort of like a theoretical foundation for the empirical method, for scientific method as it is, was laid by Bacon. Of course, you can look at, I don't know, medieval philosophy and say, some quasi-scientific stuff was there. Of course, it was there, but nobody cares, honestly. Science is a thing of 17th century, essentially. Okay, so modernity, roughly speaking. Even the works of Bacon had became popular only a few decades after his death, right? At the middle of the 17th century. Anyways, so what's the problem of universal agency? Well, again, how did science begin is Bacon and some other similarly thinking people were saying, okay, we do have a Bible, a text that describes Creator and the dealings of Creator, etc., right? So we can know the Creator through this text. But we also have the creation around us, the world, right? So, how about we study the Creator not through the text about Him, but through His creation, which is everywhere around us? So, in this sense, science was the tool of knowing God, if you know what I mean. It was essentially a religious tool. It was a subset of religious practice, science. So, if you study nature, you can figure out who created it, become a little bit closer to Him, at least, right? Something to that effect. And again, Bacon, that's why mathematics became so popular, specifically mathematical tools as a vehicle of describing nature, because again, the God supposedly created the world using mathematics, so therefore we can study it by using mathematics. This is a perfect justification for using mathematics in describing physical problems. And I might add, it's the only justification for using mathematics in considering, the world around us. Again, see my video about how do numbers relate to the world in the description. So, as you can see, it's a perfectly sound logic. So I have nothing against people who believe in God and do science as a vehicle of studying God or the creation at the very least, minimalistically speaking. But I do have a lot of problems with people who don't believe in God, even actively, dismissing God, like again, raging atheists, and still claiming that science is the pathway towards the truth, because now it has no foundation, this statement, right? So what am I returning to, like the how I call it, like the problem of universal agency? What is the universal agency we are sort of comparing our scientific descriptions with? Like, if you believe in God, you may claim, well, okay, God is kind of a good guy, you know, he wouldn't trick us, you know, God doesn't play dice, the famous quote. So, like, we as human beings are perfectly capable of knowing the truth because we are created in the image of God, and the God created the world, so we can know the world almost like we can almost create our own worlds, right? So we are perfectly capable, and mathematics is enough because God used mathematics. Like, it's all a very, very nice, elegant, logical structure, right? But if you remove God from here, like, you're left with nothing, literally. So there is no universal agency which guarantees, first of all, that we can know, we can somehow, you know, figure out the world. Secondly, there is no agency that guarantees that mathematics would be a good tool to do so. Thirdly, there is no agency that guarantees that even truth exists, right? So, and we'll return to this a little bit later, like when people say, oh, science is asymptotically approaching the truth or something like that. We'll address this a little bit later. So you can see that it's a big problem that, like, if you remove God from this picture, science has no foundation. And again, as I've already claimed in my previous video, you will need some faith. So previously it was a faith in God, or belief in God, like directly, and as a subsidiary of this faith, there was faith in science. Right now, if you remove God, if you're a raging atheist, you have to put all of your faith in science, but it's not founded on anything logically, right? There's nothing to guarantee that scientific method has anything to do with reality or the truth or whatever important like this. So hopefully you can see this problem, right? Yeah, and speaking of which, like in the previous video I've mentioned about the laws of nature. It's very curious. It's just like a side note. I'm not talking about anything really important here, but notice how like almost simultaneously, and by Francis Bacon, by the way, himself, there were like this division occurred, right? Firstly, people started talking about laws of nature, again, guaranteed by God in the case of Francis Bacon and these early theoreticians of science. And simultaneously, like the laws of people have been developed. You know, the first constitutions started to appear, like the first, you know, codes of law. And Bacon was involved in both of those, right? He started studying laws of nature and the laws of people. It's very curious. And how even, you know, like the very first, like physical experiments and devices have been presented to like royalties, is it the word, like to you know, kings and dukes and queens and stuff. So basically it was the word of the king that guaranteed that this is legit, what we're observing, right? It's a very curious, like Robert Boyle with his vacuum pump presented to the king, etc., etc. So very, very interesting dynamic. And in this respect, it's even more interesting how, for example, Britain, or like Great Britain, I guess, like Scotland and Wales and other places like this, Ireland, relates to the continent because they have different law systems, right? The precedent law versus like whatever else law. Like I'm not a specialist in law, so yeah, pretty interesting stuff to think about. And a lot of people have actually researched this, but in case you're interested, it's not hard to find info on this topic. Anyways. So what I'm saying is, for example, in England, there is like this precedent type of law for people, but for nature, there is more of this like generalist type of continental law, right? Laws of nature in this sense. And the bifurcation I'm talking about, where we're splitting kind of the world into the world for people, governed by laws for people, and the world of like nature, governed by the laws of nature. It's what Bruno Latour has focused heavily upon in his book, We Have Never Been Modern. I've definitely talked about this book in some earlier videos about science, but I don't remember which. I'm sorry. All right, let's return to our topic. So we've already discussed this first fundamental problem, the lack of universal agency if you remove God, i.e. the lack of guarantees that science works in case God, you don't believe in God, basically. Basically, all your faith is not founded on anything. Like, in case you believe in God, like, some of this belief would spill into science and logically follow from the existence of God. If you don't believe in God, then you have to put all of your faith in science alone, but it has no justification in principle. Like, it doesn't follow logically from anywhere. You know, it's a non sequitur, in Latin. It doesn't follow, literally. It doesn't follow from anywhere. So it's a purely matter of faith, right? The second problem is, again, if you look at the comments under my previous video, the part 1 of this series, people were saying, well, we assume science is correct because experience tells us so, right? So it's this empiricism they're underlining as the justification for the true character of science. But you see, although I would absolutely agree, and I did in the comments, that science does allow some cool practical applications, one of which I'm using to record this video, for example, and one of which you are using to watch it, etc., etc., etc. This is all good and well, but so do other ways of cognition. The other ways of cognition, such as, again, art, religion, philosophy, they do allow practical applications as well, even though their beliefs are non-scientific for the most part. They have nothing to do with science. Of course, you would say, well, you will never make a cell phone out of your philosophy. Yeah, but maybe you can make something even more important, right? I mean, it's all like very subjective and kind of like a matter of taste, right? When you're going to, I don't know, Milano and you're watching the Duomo, you know, the cathedral, like, it has nothing to do with science. It's pretty cool, you know? You don't go to, I don't know, Zhangjiang province of China to look at the cool mobile phone, you know, it's just not something you do. But you go to Milano to watch the cathedral, right? And it's a practical application. Like, people didn't do science back then, yet they built it somehow. And it's pretty cool. I mean, I'm just using Duomo as a puppet, as a straw man, you know. But, I mean, what I'm saying is this whole argument is kind of weird, honestly. Like, the practice as the criterion of truth, which is kind of a Marxist statement if you think about it. But what kind of practice is the question I'm actually concerned about. You see, if you use, for example, human experience as the single criterion for truth, I would ask you a question: which human are we talking about, and which exact experience? And here, a lot of scientists would have very big problems in clarifying, all right? They would just like mumble something and make some weird gestures like this, all right? They may even use the word objective. Well, then I can ask you, what is objective? Like, you see, well, let me tell you a story, actually, to illustrate what I'm meaning. I will tentatively call it the case of 11th star, just because it sounds cool. So it's a story I've made up specifically to illustrate my point. So imagine the whole of humanity. So again, remember my question. Let it kind of ring in your head while I'm telling you this story. So whose experience are we talking about? Whose experience would be the criterion for truth if we're judging science as being true by the experiences, you know, of people or whatever? So the case of 11th star. Imagine all of humanity is 10 people, just for simplicity, all right? And we ask all of these 10 people to look at the specific section of the sky and count the amount of stars they see. And imagine that 9 people say, we see 10 stars in this small segment of the sky. And the 10th person says, I see 11 stars there. So 9 people see 10, 1 person sees 11. Whose experience are we to believe? Where is the truth? Is there 11 stars or is there 10 stars? You can, I mean, change this up. You can say 8 people see 10 stars, 2 people see 11. Maybe three people only see 7. Whose experience is the correct one? You may say right now, you as like informed, scientifically literate, blah, blah, blah person from the 21st century, you may say, well, there's probably 11. There's just like these other people, they don't have a good enough eyesight to notice, right? But like, don't you see the problem? Like, if a person tells you, you have a bad aura, I can feel it, you would probably say, this is just rubbish, it's not scientific. But what if you have a bad aura? It's just that no one else can feel it. Only this person. Just as with the 11th star. Only this person can sense it because, well, they have just a more finely tuned senses. And the other people don't see it. They don't feel it. Maybe there's 1,000 people on the planet that can sense your aura. They're just not meeting you anytime soon because there's too many people on the planet and the distances are too far. You're just never going to meet them in your whole life. Like, is this a legit experience? Is this scientific? I mean, by your criterion as like experience is the criterion, I mean, like the validation tool for science, it is scientific, right? Because, like, returning to the case of 11th star, you may say, well, maybe, like, if this experiment happened prehistorically, so to speak, this observation rather, not an experiment, we may say, well, sometime later people will invent telescopes and they will see this 11th star. Well, the same argument can be made about aura, you know. Maybe in 500 years, people would develop tools to measure people's auras. How about that? So, how can you, after that, dismiss with your reasoning that experience is the criterion for truth in science, and consequently criterion of science as being true in the first place? How can you dismiss something like an aura as being non-scientific? You can't. That's the correct answer. So, shut up, my raging atheist friend. So, yeah, you can see these problems. Lack of universal agency, so we cannot claim that science is the pathway towards truth, because we can't even know if there's truth when we remove God, I repeat, right? When we're a stupid, raging atheist. And secondly, if we use the experience as our only criterion for truth in science, as well as our only criterion for science as being true itself, we cannot ever make a claim that something is not scientific, right? If it is, at least in someone's experience. Okay? So how can you dismiss like ramblings of mad people in this respect? Maybe they have transitioned to some sort of deeper feeling kind of state, so they can see and feel and hear and whatever more than you can. And maybe again in 1,000 years, some new theory would arrive, some new instruments would be built, and all these things could be observed by regular humans even. You just can't make this statement that it is impossible, right? Because again, even if you look at the history of science, this is actually how science was evolving, right? We can observe and feel, with the help of instruments, more and more stuff. We can experience more and more stuff, etc. So let's address this point that I've already mentioned, that again, some people have made in the comments to the previous video. Well, science is not telling the truth, but it at least allows us to approximate it, like closer and closer to the truth. And my argument against this is very simple. If you don't know the truth, if you don't even know if it exists or not, because again, you've removed God already, how can you claim you're approximating the truth? Like, if you don't know where the truth is, like you're approximating something, maybe, like if you like intuitively plot our knowledge as some sort of graph, and you see that it kind of approaches something, how do you know it approaches the truth and not something else? Like, I would say, just purely like tautologically, what we can observe is that it approaches the limits of science itself, right? That here I can agree, but whether it has to do anything with truth or not, we cannot judge, because we don't know the truth, firstly, and even worse, we don't even know if truth exists or not. In fact, we're pretty sure it doesn't if we remove God. Okay? There's just no universal agency, as I call it, to guarantee that the truth exists. So yeah, we only are approaching the limits of what scientific method itself can give us. That's what we are approaching, not the truth. So shut up again, my little raging atheist. Okay, so then people may tell you something about being objective. I've already talked about this. Like, if you look at the history of positivistic philosophy, like the only reasonable philosophy of science, which again ended up completely, crashing and basically claiming that, no, science has no justifications whatsoever. So they've tried to come to the concept of so-called atomic facts. Like, let's just remove any possible interpretation and let's just focus on what we observe. We don't say we measure current 2 amperes. We say the arrow of our device is about here-ish, right? Etc. But the problem is that's not science, right? For science, you need like meaningful statements. And on these meaningful statements, again, as I've explored in the previous video, by induction, you build some sort of dependencies, correlations, and from there you derive some sort of laws, right? So induction is the main method of science. By the way, Francis Bacon was talking exactly about that. This was the basis of empirical method. You have limited set of observations, and the induction is the main method, what I call stretching the blanket, right? In between 2 data points, is the method of deriving of physical law and therefore knowing the nature and therefore knowing the creator of the nature. So science without induction is completely useless, all right? So whether you adhere to the idea of atomic facts, by themselves, they are completely useless. You need induction on top of them to make some meaningful statements about the nature. And therefore, again, as we've explored in the previous video, you need faith, ultimately. There's no other basis for induction. Okay. So, since by its very nature science is inductive, as we've already discussed, it can never prohibit anything. That's an interesting conclusion, alright? So, a black swan type of thing can always happen. And what do I mean? Like, if we only observe white swans, right? These are our data points, and we make an inductive claim that all swans are white, once we observe the black swan, our statement becomes incorrect. And therefore, you can see how if we only observe white swans, we cannot ever prohibit the existence of black swans. We just can't. It's the inherent flaw of inductive method. The fact that you've only observed white swans doesn't mean that a black one does not exist. All right? Which means science as an inductive discipline, if you wish, cannot ever prohibit anything. Basically, you cannot make a statement, this is scientifically impossible, because science is an inductive discipline. You see what I'm saying? Hopefully you can. So, yeah. So you, if you are honest with yourself, can never say this is scientifically impossible about anything. So, I mean, there's so much to talk about, and I don't want this video to be like an hour long, so let's just wrap it up. Maybe I'll make a part 3 at some point. Maybe not. We'll see. We'll see by the comments under this one. So, conclusions, alright? Once you remove God, you can no longer say that, first, science leads us to truth, and second, something is scientifically impossible. Like, these statements are just not valid, if you are honest with yourself again. They are only valid if you place all of your faith in science and deny that you're doing that. So you're just kind of lying to yourself and everyone else. Like, if you're a scientist, as in scientism, like a blind belief in science, blind faith rather, and you say, I believe in science just because I believe in science, I have faith in science, then okay, I'm fine with that. But then, how can you criticize people who have faith in something else? It's just stupid. Alright? Well, hopefully you can see my point. Thank you for watching. The eons are closing. If you wish to support me, please consider joining my Patreon. That is patreon.com/philosopher. See the link in the description. Or if you have a scientific theory of your own and you'd like my help in developing it, please join my alternative science coaching program, also available through Patreon.